I think China has several important goals in the United Nations, at least four goals that I would describe. First important thing would be to do no harm to China's major interests. And so China has an increasing number of interests that come up in the UN, given the fact that China has expanding economic interests, overseas interests. And so you have some countries that come up for review, consideration for UN action. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It holds a veto. And so when the UN Security Council debates issues like Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, so on, China has a voice, and I think China's fundamental goal is to make sure that its key interests with respect to these countries are preserved. So what are those key interests? Those interests could include economic equities. So China is a major oil trader with Sudan and Iran, so it tries to protect those interests from sanctions in particular. China is a neighboring country of other countries like North Korea and Myanmar, and so when the UN contemplates coercion or sanctions or things that China might think are destabilizing, China will try to avoid the worst outcomes. But that leads to kind of a second interest, which is maintaining cooperation with other key countries in the UN Security Council. So the US has a seat at the table, the Europeans, the Russians, and I think China weighs its relations equities with these major countries as well. And China sometimes does end up cooperating. China wants to be a member of the international community. It wants to be seen as a responsible stakeholder. And so China rarely, it sometimes says no completely, but in a lot of cases, it negotiates and it actually does try to find a solution so that it can say that it's part of a solution, that it has an affirmative agenda, and that it's not always simply saying no to things. And so I think you saw that in cases like Iran, where China sat down and went through a long process of negotiation, and it could end up saying, we're part of the solution. We're part of working with the US, the Europeans, and the others. And so China, I think, it looks to its interests, it looks to its image as a responsible country. I think a third interest would be responding to criticism of China. So in the past, in the 90s and the 2000s, I think a major Chinese foreign policy goal was to reject proposals by countries to criticize China's human rights record, and China had to draw on the goodwill of a lot of diplomatic partners to overturn or to reject proposals in the UN Human Rights Commission. More recently, there's a Human Rights Council, and it works a little bit differently, but I think one of China's goals is still to refute attempts to use UN mechanisms to criticize China's human rights practices. So that's another thing. And then a last goal, I think, would be to, not necessarily within the United Nations, but sort of with respect to it, would be to keep certain countries out or keep certain countries at a lower status. So China wants to keep Taiwan out of the UN because UN membership would confer a certain status on Taiwan. So this is something that comes up occasionally. Taiwan's bid for membership, China says no. Of course, with Japan, Japan has been seeking a permanent membership in the Security Council for some time, supported by the US. China is vigorously opposed to that, and I think China uses its influence to say no to some of those objectives as well. So that's kind of an overview of China's goals. When we look at China's perspectives on sovereignty and intervention and UN interference in countries' internal affairs, I think we have to distinguish between two things. So rhetoric on one hand, what does China say? And reality or practice on the other hand, what does China actually do? Rhetorically, China has been very much a strong supporter of state sovereignty, and it makes its position clear all the time in speeches and major policy documents and things like this. And there are reasons for this. So China was subject of foreign intervention in the past. In the 19th century, it worried about the UN potentially being used to interfere in China's affairs in Taiwan and Tibet and Xinjiang. So on one hand, you have this kind of rhetorical opposition that's based partly in self-interest. But on the other hand, you have a more complex reality of practice. So in the UN, China often abstains on proposals to sanction countries. In some cases, China votes for sanctions against countries. In addition, China has moved beyond, if you're looking at peacekeeping in particular, China has moved from abstaining on virtually every peacekeeping vote out of principled opposition to generally supporting peacekeeping operations, and indeed supporting larger, more complex, and more invasive peacekeeping operations. So I think in practice, China doesn't want to oppose the UN doing these things. In some cases, China has an interest in the UN getting involved. And so the result of that is you have this delicate and often difficult balance in China's UN policy between maintaining a rhetorical or normative consistency on sovereignty, but on the other hand, sometimes signing up to difficult things like sanctions and peacekeeping. And China, I think, has found that in some cases, in a limited sense, the latter can actually be useful for China by going in and solving difficult problems. And I think going forward, China will continue to face this difficult balance between supporting sovereignty, and we've seen that on Syria in particular recently, but also thinking about how the UN can be used in a more invasive sense in peacekeeping and sanctions to accomplish goals. And so I think that'll be a difficult balance and one that Chinese leaders will have to face. China, if you look at military interventions in general, China tends to be opposed to military intervention. I think on one reason is that China tends to support sovereignty and oppose sort of interventionism. I think in general, Beijing tends to believe that intervention is counterproductive. It makes problems worse than they would otherwise. And so I think China tends to be skeptical about the use of force. I think if China is going to support military intervention, one of the key criteria will be how involved is the UN Security Council. I think China tends to be very opposed to unilateral intervention, especially by the US, by NATO. And so if there is going to be an intervention, China will want the UN Security Council, where it has a veto, to sign off on that. So that will be one criteria. But if you look at more specific situations, I think China's position will depend on a number of factors. So one factor would be sort of what are the regional political dynamics? Do regions support an intervention, or are regions divided? And so I think if you look at Libya, the African Union and the Arab League they tended to support coercion. And if China said no to an entire region, that would have been difficult for China. But on Syria, where China has been opposed to coercion, I think you have a region that's much more divided. And so that's easier for China to say no. A second criteria would be, where does Russia sit? China doesn't like to be isolated in the Council. China doesn't want to have to exercise the sole veto. It's very unpopular because China has to take the brunt of the criticism. So if Russia opposes a military intervention, I think it's easier for China to say no. If Russia is equivocal or supports an intervention, China may end up supporting or abstaining just because it doesn't want to be isolated. And then a third factor would be in terms of China's own interests. So China has more and more people on the ground in countries where the UN might want to do an intervention. So a country like Libya, where there are, let's say, tens of thousands of Chinese people, and if worse comes to worse, if there's a leader that is not capitulating, then I think China may have to think twice. It may have to think very seriously about whether or not an intervention should be used to save Chinese lives. And we saw that very clearly with Libya. I think we saw that to a certain extent with Yemen. And I think going forward, we'll continue to see potentially more pressure on China to do intervention to protect Chinese interests. On the other hand, China is a more confident and some would say assertive country. And so in cases where China doesn't want intervention, it may be increasingly powerful and able to resist political pressure and to maybe use its veto more often. So I think that too will be a scenario where China has mixed interests and in some cases may support intervention, but in other cases may be more prepared politically to say no to the US and to say no to NATO and the West. China's position on UN Security Council expansion China actually supports, in principle, UN Security Council expansion. China says that the UN should be more representative and diverse and geographically inclusive, and this is a constant position. On the other hand, China says that UN Security Council reform requires consensus from the regions, and so that's a very, very difficult task. It's a very high bar because countries tend to be divided on which countries should be included on the Security Council. So if China says consensus is a requirement, that's almost tantamount to saying that we won't support real efforts, real proposals. So I think there's two reasons for this kind of generally speaking, opposition to reform. One is that China it's a status quo power in the Security Council. It has a veto. If you expand the Security Council, that creates more countries with vetoes, that dilutes China's veto. And so any of the current five would have a certain incentive to say no to expansion because it makes their veto power less special. And the second reason is that China is opposed to certain countries, in particular Japan, but also India and in general US partners and allies from gaining a stronger voice on the Security Council. But Japan, I think, has been the key, one of the key obstacles to Chinese opposition, historical antagonism, current rivalries in the East China Sea, relationships between that country is not good. And so I think China has been very opposed. This has even become a popular issue in China. If you think back to 2005, some of the riots or protests in several Chinese cities were explicitly about keeping Japan out of the Security Council. So hard for Chinese leaders to resist that kind of popular pressure. So I think going forward, you'll see China maybe open to some possibilities for reform in terms of including more or new countries as non-veto holding members on the council. But in terms of expanding the permanent membership, I think it's not likely because China doesn't have incentives to do it.